Okay, so for this week's lecture, we're going to be talking about layers, objects, properties, and UCS manipulation. Uh, Remember, I will not be here physically, but I will be back on Tuesday. So if you have questions, just kind of wait maybe and contact me then. We have covered quite a bit up to week 3. So week 4, this will be open for you here. And under week 4, we have the commands that we're going to discuss. So we're going to talk about layering today. And this is a really big topic in CAD. In fact, it's probably one of the things that separates CAD drawing from manual drafting, in my opinion. So it kind of makes the difference. And layers are going to be a way of fracturing out your drawing into several more or less sheets of paper. And then you can apply properties to these layers, such as color, layer, line type. So we'll be going all of that over that. There's also a way to set color independently on objects. So you can either do it via layering, or you can do it by setting a current color. So there's 2 methodologies. Same thing with this concept of line types, line weights. So we kind of have to differentiate on how you do that kind of stuff. And there's a preferred method, which most people in the CAD world usually do everything through or via layers. That's the best bet. Then you have this little guy called LT scale, we'll talk about, which is associated with line types. We'll look at properties, which allows us to do the properties for objects and manipulate those. Match props is a way of quickly getting properties on one object to look like another object. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the UCS. And I'm going to show you a couple things about it, because when we do this next assignment, assignment 4, which will be starting on Wednesday, you're going to need to know how to do that UCS and UCS manipulation. So that's kind of what we're going to head into. So I'm going to go ahead and fire up AutoCAD. And we have AutoCAD fired up. I've got a drawing open to kind of explain some stuff. So we're going to look at layers. And layers on the Home tab. We see that if we go over here, there's a whole section over here that's called layers. So all of this stuff right in this area, you see the layers. There's what is called the layer properties manager, and this guy's called your layer control dialog box. So they kind of do similar things, but with the properties manager, you can do more. So we'll be concentrating on that a little bit. These are quick ways of making settings within layers. So those are some pretty cool stuff. And then if you drop this down, you'll also see there's other things that you can get into in terms of layering. So those are some good ways of creating things. Also, and this is going to be kind of a little point of confusion, you also have properties over here. And properties can be in terms of color. So this is your color property right here. This is your line weight property, and this last box is here's line type. So there are things about this that's important, because there's 2 ways to do things. You can do it via layer, or you can do it via properties. So we'll take a look at that. Here's your match properties command. That's one that we're going to be looking at. And then there's this other command here. This is called your properties command. So this is your properties dialog box. So we're going to be spending the majority of time dealing with these kind of things. So let's explain what a layer is. So you see this drawing here. It's somewhat of a complex drawing, and I think you can recognize that it's a site plan, and it's got a building and sidewalks, or driveways and pavements and all of that stuff. And what you should notice is that it has certain color schemes. You know, that's magenta, and that's a greenish, and that's a darker green. That one's gray. And then you also have line types that are associated with it. So I have what's called a dashed line and a hidden line. I might have, that's called a phantom line. That's a center line type. So there's different types of line types that are happening here. And I could also have line weights, which kind of would look like a wide polyline, although they're not polylines in that sense. But what we do with layers is we have the ability to take this drawing and fracture it out so that objects that are the same type of object or the same property of objects would exist on a layer. And you can think of a layer as a page, a piece of paper. Now, these pieces of paper are not like that you can't see through. They're not opaque. They are transparent. So any object that goes on that can be seen through to the next one, to the next one, and to the next one. And like pages in a book, these layers are always bound together so that you can't get one layer out of sequence with the other, because that would change the geometry from one layer set to the other, and that's an impossibility. Also, unlike pages in a book, if you have 1,000 pages in a book, you're going to have a pretty thick book. If you have 1,000 layers in a drawing, you're not going to see any Z value to them. So these guys are all effectively sitting on the same plane. So you don't have any of that going on. So any object that goes on a particular layer then can take on properties associated with that layer. So again, we see that we have, that's a dashed line, it's gray, that's a cyan color, and it's hidden. And those are on their own layers. And so they are taking on those properties. And so what this allows me to do is several things. Give them color, or change the color, give them line type, or change the line type, give them line weight, and I can also deal with visibility. So this is where it really is different from manual drafting. I could basically draw this picture by hand, but the problem is if somebody said, well, I really don't want to see a particular aspect, like I don't want to see this existing building that's sitting here, I would have to go in and erase it. Well, with a layer, it's just a simple process. If you would just do what's called a freeze, I would just take that object, say I want to freeze that, and it just gets rid of it. So it acts like it doesn't even exist. And you notice I have these points here. I can freeze these points. I can freeze this layer. So there's all these things that I can, that one was locked, so it wouldn't freeze. So there's all these ways you can do this, and then what you have is essentially different drawings based on whether you have these layers turned on or off. So again, that really separates things, because manual drafting, I would have to erase all that stuff, and then if somebody said, oh yeah, okay, now I need that house back, well, you'd have to redraw it. And so obviously that becomes a major problem. So layers, easy to manipulate. The layer properties dialog box is like right here, and the layer control dialog box is here. And I just want to show you, this drawing has a lot of layers associated with it. So this is what you might see in a typical drawing. If I open this up, notice all the layers that are associated with this drawing. So they have a name, they have a color, they have other properties, but you notice this thing is just gazillion layers. This is not uncommon to the mapping world. And when you guys get into the GIS realm, they are also going to use layers. They also call them layers, and they work exactly the same way they do in AutoCAD, so that's kind of the cool news. And some drawings are going to be very complex with layers, and some drawings are not going to be very complex. So it just depends on what you're doing and how you utilize your layers. All right, so what we're going to do is first start out, now that we see, how we have these layers, I want to show you how to create them, how to set properties on them, and how to manipulate them. And then we'll take a look at some of the other finer points about layers. And then I'm going to introduce the concept of color, line type, and line weight to show you that you can have what are called overrides. And you don't typically want to mix the two methods. And again, we'll see kind of exactly what I'm talking about as we get into this. So I'm going to just close this drawing because we're not going to really need it. And I'll tell you what, maybe we'll just leave it. If we need to come back to it, I'll have it. So I'm going to go to a new drawing. So if you begin a new drawing in AutoCAD, you always have a single layer in it. Okay, you have to have a piece of paper, in other words, to draw on. So AutoCAD always has provided for you a drawing layer, and the drawing layer has a name, and it happens to be this guy up here, which is called the 0 layer. That's its name, 0. Then the 0 layer has some special properties associated with it, and in reality, once you get into CAD, a lot of times we always say that you don't really want to draw on the 0 layer, and we've of course been violating that since the beginning because we've been drawing everything on the 0 layer, and it's not a big deal. But when you get into higher level applications, you'll find that you really kind of want to keep your 0 layer clean. And if I open up this guy, this is called my layer control dialog box. I just click on this. You'll notice I only have a single layer as opposed to the other one that probably had about 60 or 70 layers. And you could actually have drawings. I mean, you could have drawings with up to thousands of layers. And in fact, AutoCAD basically tells people that it's an unlimited number of layers, and the reality is that's not true. You can't have an infinite number. They do have a fixed number. I think it's 32,560. So it used to be that. You really would not want to have 32,000 layers in a drawing. Trust me, just manipulating through that dialog box would be very, very slow. So I will tell you though, I've had drawings that probably had 200 in them. So that's especially in mapping, that's not uncommon. So we need to determine, how do we create layers? How do we create properties on them? And then how do we work with them? So we really can't do that in this box. Again, this is called your layer control dialog box. What we're going to do is use the command called layer. So you can either type in the name layer, L-A-Y-E-R, or you can type in its alias, which is LA, or the easiest way to get to it is just probably just click on this guy, which is what I'm going to do. And this is called the layer properties manager. And notice the actual name of the command is layer. So when I click on this, it's going to open up a dialog box for me, which is pretty big dialog box. And what we're looking at is the layer manager. And there are properties associated with each layer. So we're going to take a look at those. And I'm going to, if you can't see the name here, you can just click on that till you get a double-headed arrow, and you can drag the size of that out so you can actually read it. So you might want to do that so it kind of mimics my screen, because it may look different than mine if you're trying to do this with me. All right, so let's go through the properties, explain each piece of property, and then we're going to create some layers and start to play with this a little bit. So each layer that you create in a drawing always has a name. It has to be a unique name. So you can't have two names that are the same. That's one thing, so it won't let you do that. The naming convention works like any naming convention in Windows. So it's basically 256 characters. Okay, so if you wanted to have 256 characters, you could. That would be kind of crazy. But I do try to name my layers so that they are descriptive. You can simply just call them like 1, 2, 3 or ABC, or if you create layers in AutoCAD, it's just going to call it layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. But the problem is, of course, you'll work on this drawing maybe now, and then 2 months later come back to it and say, well, what's on layer 3? But if I call layer 3 sewer manholes, or let's say property lines, or trees, or sidewalk, I'll know exactly what it is. So I usually like to use the descriptions of some kind, but I don't like to use huge names, okay? You can also use some special characters, like you can use the underscore, $, hyphen, I think spaces are even allowed, but the slash character and the backslash character are illegal because those are switches in Windows, and so it will not let you use those. All right, so the naming is the first thing. Okay, so then we have, if we go across this group here, we have what's called on and freeze. Okay, so what this is allowing me to do, these things are governing what we call visibility. So if a layer is on, you can see it on the screen. If it's off, you can't. And that also works for the printer. So if you see it on the screen, you're going to see it on the printer, because printer uses what's called WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. So a layer that's on is visible, a layer that's off is invisible. So the objects that are on that layer are going to be visible or invisible. So freeze does the same thing. Freeze, if it's thawed, right now it's in what's called a thaw state, because you can see that little sun there. If you click on that, he freezes it. Well, he won't let me do it now, but we'll see. But when you click on it, it looks like a little ice crystal or a snowflake. Then that'll be in what's called a frozen state. So a layer that is frozen is invisible, and a layer that is thawed is visible. So this layer is considered thawed right now. Now, there's a couple of things that are different. You might think, well, what's the difference? Okay, if they're on or they're thawed, it's the same thing, and truly it is. But the difference is that if you turn objects off, they're invisible from the screen. However, you still can select them. So that can be dangerous, because if I do a particular type of modifier, such as I say erase all, even though I'm not seeing the objects on the screen, it's actually going into the database, it's harvesting them, and it's deleting them. If you freeze objects, you protect them. So it will make them invisible to the screen, which means you can't select them with, say, a pick box or a window or a crossing. But if an erase all would not select them either, because they're going to be protected. So those are states of visibility: on, off, freeze, thaw. I mean, between the two of them, I always use freeze, because not only do I get visibility, but I also get protection. In the original days of CAD, the difference between these two is when you turned objects on and off, you didn't go through a regeneration process. And when you froze and thawed objects, you did go through a regeneration. And a regeneration is a recalculation of your whole drawing when it displays it. And the problem was, in the older days of CAD, when you had slow processors and not much RAM, you literally, if you did a regeneration on your drawing, if it was a complex drawing, you would probably go back and get a cup of coffee and then come back, and your drawing would still not be back on the screen. Nowadays, with the modern technology and our processors that we're using and everything, a regen is not that big of a deal. So again, if you have a choice, on, off, freeze, thaw, I typically use freeze. All right, so the ultimate protection on any object is to lock the layer that they exist on. So when you lock it, notice when I click on it, the lock snaps shut. When you lock an object, or lock a layer rather, you lock up the objects. So what that means is objects can still be visible on the screen if you lock them. However, they cannot be selected. Okay, so you can still see them, but you can never select them. So that's your ultimate type of protection. The other thing about lock is that's kind of neat is if you lock a layer, you can still snap to the objects on that layer. So you can get endpoints, midpoints, center points, quad points, those kind of things. Even though the object is locked up, I can't select it, but I can snap it. So that's cool. All right, so this next one here is called plot, no plot. So on the plotter, if you want certain objects to be visible to the plotter, you leave it to this state. If you don't want objects to be visible to the printer or the plotter, you can just do that. So the advantage of that is they can still be visible on the screen, but the plotter won't see them. So if I do that, turn things off, when I turn the layer off, objects are going to be invisible on the screen. They're also going to be invisible to the printer. But by doing this, they're still visible on the screen, but they're going to be always invisible to the printer or the plotter. So that's a really key important process there. Now you have to be careful with this one. If you go in and create layers right now in this state, every layer that I create is going to be no plot. And so what will happen is you'll draw all your objects and everything looks good, and you'll go to print and you'll say, well, I don't have any objects showing up in my preview. And typically the reason is that you've got everything set to a no plot state. So I usually don't set that until I'm ready to plot, actually. All right, so these are states that deal with how the objects look: color, line type, and line weight, and transparency. So we kind of have four things here that we're looking at, okay? So color is a way of saying, okay, this layer is red, and then all the objects that go on that layer will inherit that color. So they will all show up red. So notice you have color, and it says it's white. This guy's an active box. If I click on him, he's going to open up this thing called an image tile. And what we're getting is the ability to set color up via this image tile. So what we have here in AutoCAD are several ways of setting colors. Either what are called index colors, which gives you 250, I think it's 256 colors. And then you have what are called true colors and color books. And by mixing and matching these kind of things, you can get 16, I think it's 16.7 million colors or something like that, availability in AutoCAD. Most of the time I use the index colors. And so let's take a look at this, because this is going to be probably one of the more common ways of doing it. So you have colors up here, which are, these are just given a number. So notice that's number, if I click on that, that's number 80, and that's number 249. Okay, so all of these up here, they just have a number. And by the way, these colors right here can look different than they do on your screen because it has to do with what your color card is in your computer. So, or your graphics card. So there are 7 standard colors and they're down here. And say we want to look at these. These are the ones I use the most often. So these all have numbers, but they also have names where everything up in here is just a number. So the 7 colors, why they're called standard colors is because this one's red and it'll look red on anybody's computer, no matter what your graphics card is. So all of these colors here will always look the same on everybody's computer, but when you get up here, they can look different. So the first color here is red. It's also color 1, okay? So this has both a number, notice there's an index color number, and then there's a name. So this one is 2, and it's also yellow. This one is 3, also known as green. This one is 4, also known as cyan. 5 is blue. 6 is magenta, and 7 is white, okay? Then once we get past that to color 8, notice 8 up here and 8 down here. They don't have a differentiation, all right? So again, 7 standard colors: red, yellow, green, cyan, blue, magenta, white. And white is kind of interesting because white will look white on a black background, but if you have a black background, it'll actually, I'm sorry, if you have a black background, it'll look white, but if you have a white background, it'll actually look black, because otherwise you won't be able to see it. There is actually another white color down here. That one, you got to be careful with that one, because if you use that color, basically your printer won't be able to see those lines. So those lines will disappear. I mean, it'll look like they don't show up on the printer. It can't print them because your printer can't plot white. Even though this says white, it's a different white. Okay, kind of weird. So the cool thing about colors is they are on demand. I can grab them whenever I want. Okay, and again, I use primarily the 7 standard colors because I know I'm always going to get the same color. And most of these are just shades of greens or blues or whatever anyway, so they're not that big of a deal. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and leave that for now. All right, so the other thing we have here is a line type. So a line type is a pattern of dashes and dots and those kind of things that appear on that. And we were looking at that in that mapping. I had what I called a center line and a hidden. Well, you notice when you click on this dialog box, there aren't any line types in my drawing other than a line type that is called a continuous line. So these are not on demand. You must go out to a line type library and load these guys into your drawing if you want to use them. So it's a very simple process. You just go down here to the load button. It'll take you to the line type box, and you will see it's looking in a library automatically called the acad.lin file. So within that, there are all these different line types that exist, and some of them are pretty cool. You've got some that will put text in there, like HW for hot water, or zigzag, or you got some really strange ones in there. And then you just have the normal type of graphic ones. So what I normally do is I just load every line type that's out there into my drawing because they take up minimal amounts of space. And if I want to use a line type, I don't have to keep loading it, so I already have it. So here's how we load everything. You just come into this box right here and you right click, and you'll notice there's a select all, clear all option. You go to select all, and then you just hit OK. And what I've done now, all of these have been loaded into my drawing now. So these are now available and in my drawing. So if I close this box and come back to it, you notice there they are, okay? But again, if I go to a new drawing, they will not be in there. So you're going to have to load your line types every time, okay? So the line weights have kind of superseded now polylines, because at one time, a polyline was the only way that we could have a weight on our line. And now with the inclusion of line weights and layers, we can do that. So if you go to the line weight, these guys are also on there all by demand, and they are set either to millimeters or you can turn them on to inches. I'm going to show you the difference, but these are preset, and you cannot just use whatever number. So I can't use a 0.26 millimeter. It's either 0.2 or 0.25. Okay. Also, they use what's called a default line weight, and the default line weight actually is not 0, okay? 0 millimeters would also not show up on the printer. It would be so minuscule of a line that it basically either shows up lightly or hardly at all, or it just doesn't show up. So there, I think, I forget, I think it's maybe 0.25 is the actual default setting. We'll take a look at that here in a minute. So, okay, so I'm going to just cancel out of there. And then we have a thing called transparency. So if you have a polyline that's sitting on top of another line, the line underneath the polyline won't show up because it's solid and it's opaque, so you can't see it. But you can set that down to a transparency so that you can start to see through it. And that's kind of a neat principle. And it goes from 0 to 90. So 90 is the most transparent you can have it. And you can set it in settings of, they've got it in units of 10, but I can come in here and say I want it at 55, so I don't have to use these. Okay, and the cool thing about transparency also, you can actually plot your plotter with transparency or not transparency. You don't need to use it. Okay, so those are our major properties. We're not going to worry about this guy called new VP freeze or description or anything else. So, so you got name, visibility on, visibility freeze, protection, lock, plot, availability or not, and then you have these things, the 4 things that affect the look of the line or the objects: color, line type, line weight, transparency. Okay? So we're going to now go in and show you how to create objects, or excuse, how to create line types. It's very simple. We just come up to this box right there, and that's going to create a new layer. So I just click on that, and notice the layer comes out. And it'll automatically call it layer 1. It's giving me the chance right now to rename it. And I can type in a new layer, but for what I'm doing right now, I won't mess with that. But like I said, if this is going to be my tree layer, I'd probably type in tree. If I create the layer without naming it, I can always come back and rename it after the fact. So that's not a hard thing to do. Okay, so we're going to create a layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, and layer 4. Now, what you might notice is all of the properties of layer 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the same as a layer 0, and the reason is because that's the layer they were created from. So if we had set this to a no plot here, these guys would all be no plot. If we had set that red, these would all be red, okay? So that's not a big deal, but just recognize it, that when you're creating a layer, you're creating it via another layer that's active, okay? So we're gonna go up and start to make some changes on this. So we're gonna go up to layer 1, just click on layer 1, and we're gonna go to the color, and we're gonna make the color layer 1, we're gonna make it red. So I'm just gonna say, okay, I wanna make that red. Now we're not doing this for any reason right now, but I will be like enforcing standards on you. And by the way, when you do work with certain agencies or whatever, like if you were working with the Ohio Department of Transportation, they have a whole layer scheme that if you're a consultant for them, you have to make sure you follow their layer, color, line type, line weight, naming convention, all of that. So some people are really rigorous about it and some people aren't. Okay. Okay, so we have color. Let's go over here and we're going to change this up to a different color, or a line weight type, excuse me. So let's make this one what we call a center line type. So you just click on that and you hit OK, and notice it says center. I'm not going to worry about line weights right now or transparencies. We're going to handle that later. Okay, so we're going to come to layer 2. We're going to make this a different color. And I don't know, I'm not going to use yellow. I think that's pretty light for your screen to be able to see. So I'm going to go ahead and do green this time. And I'm going to set this up to a different line type. So let's get a nice outrageous line type. Let's say like, let's do zigzag. Zigzag is a good one. Okay, so this one's going to be very interesting. You'll see how this works. So we're going to go into layer 3. Layer 3, we're going to make that a nice cyan color. And I'm going to use a line type called gas line. So I'm going to find out where gas line is. There's my gas line. And it's going to insert the word gas into it, which is kind of cool. All right, so notice it says gas line. And I'm going to create another layer, color. We'll go ahead and make this blue. And we'll make this, let's see what we want to do on this one. We'll do another one that's very commonly used. We'll do what's called a dashed one. Oh, let's do hidden. Hidden's got usually a little bit smaller spacing. Okay. So again, you're going to set these up based on what you think you're going to be utilizing. And the cool thing is I can switch things back and forth anytime I want. So it's not a big deal once you begin to start to use these. All right, one other thing. You notice over here that now that we have the layers created, okay, they're there. So if I close this dialog box, okay, they're there. If I open up my control layer dialog box, there they are. Used to be back in the original days of AutoCAD, if you got out of this box without hitting, there was an OK somewhere you had to hit. If you didn't do that OK, it actually just dumped everything you did, but you don't have to worry about that. Once I put it in there, it's in there. All right, so layers can be created. They can also be destroyed. Just to show you, if I create another layer off of this guy, all right, layer 5, notice he has the same principles, by the way. If you don't want that layer to be around anymore, you can just come up here and say delete it. Okay, now there's a couple of things that you need to be aware of that when you try to delete layers. Any layer that has objects on it cannot be deleted, okay? So that didn't have any objects on it, so there was no problem with that. Any layer that is current cannot be deleted. So I didn't talk about current layer, so let's do that real quick. You notice this green check, and this green check is right here. That green check can only occur at one layer. So in other words, you can only have one piece of paper that you're drawing on at a time, even though you may have 1,000 pieces of paper. So I go to the layer that I want to make current, and then I put that check on. Okay, or I can just double click that and it makes it current. But if I tried to delete that one right now, you'll notice you get this, that layer cannot be deleted, okay? So there is another thing about the zero layer. The zero layer is special. If you click on the zero layer and try to delete him, you'll never be able to delete him either, whether he's current or not. So you're never gonna get rid of the zero layer, okay? It's not gonna happen. All right, so let's go ahead. We're going to make this layer the current layer, and I'm going to go ahead and click out of here. Okay, so this box always shows you what the current layer is, and it shows you whether the layer is on or off, frozen or thawed, locked or unlocked. It also shows you the color, and it shows you the name. And this box is kind of cool because I can set this on off, freeze thaw, or lock unlock. And I can even change the color in here. If I just click on the box, it'll open up the color box. That's kind of neat. But you cannot create layers in there. You can't set line types in there or line weights or any of that stuff. Okay, so you have to go back to the manager to do some of that stuff. All right. Also, this is cool too. If you open this guy up and just click on a layer, it automatically becomes the current layer. Okay, so let's go back. Let's make sure layer 0 is the current layer. Okay. Now you might also notice while you're clicking things over here, there's things happening over here. And it's saying by layer for the color, by layer for the line weight, and by layer for the line type. So what that means, and this is an important concept, what that means is that the color, the line type, and the line weight are going to be governed by whatever the layer says it is. Okay. If you come over here and you set this to a color, line weight, or line type, that's going to override whatever the layer says. And I'm going to show you the difference on that. But you pretty much always want this to say by layer, by layer, by layer. Okay, just suffice that to say that right now. So we're going to go out and draw some objects. And we're going to see that they're going to show up white and continuous. I'm going to grab a line, do a couple of line objects, just for not any reason, just to see that how this is working. Okay, you notice they're white, they're continuous. All right, draw a circle, same thing. All right, so we can see how that works. That's what we've been doing forever. So now we're going to open this up and we're going to set it to layer 1. So this is telling me this should be red. And this is showing me the current line. I believe that's a center line type. So let's see what happens. I'm going to go out here and draw an arc. 1, 2, 3. And you'll notice there it is. It's red. And that's a center line type. And what's really cool about this line type, it looks like it actually broke the arc. But those spaces really don't exist. That's kind of like a mask that you have placed on it. Okay. And this is something, if you were doing this with manual drafting, that's a real pain because you have to either draw that line as a continuous line, and then you come back and delete, or erase, 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 erase. That's really hard to do. But in AutoCAD, it's a snap. All right, so notice that arc, rectangle, any object that you draw is going to take on these properties, including text and points. Now, the one thing about text will take on the color, but it will ignore the line type, because obviously if you have dashes or spaces going on in your text, it may make it unreadable. So text, it always ignores the line type, but it will take on color, okay? All right, so I think you guys get the idea. That might want to put another line if you want. Okay, I'm going to put me a polyline down. Okay, just put a couple of objects so you can kind of get the feel for it. All right, so we're gonna now migrate to layer 2. Okay, green and zigzag. Now watch, this one's pretty neat. So if I go pick a point, pick another point, and pick another point, notice that line looks like it's zigging and zagging. It really isn't. It's just, it's going from, notice there's an end point there and an end point there and a midpoint. So these corners actually don't exist. If I tried to snap to that out there, it wouldn't let me. So if I try to go to a line, if I tried to snap a line to that, it won't let me. Okay, so there, it's just the way it looks. Again, circle will be pretty cool. That's kind of a nice symbol. You know, arc, all of these things are just taking on those properties, right? Hopefully everybody's getting this to work. All right, so we're going to go back to another layer here, layer 3. Okay, so this one is, I think, our gas line. So notice if we generate a point from here to here, to here, to here, to here, if I look up at what that's saying, you can notice it's got the word gas inserted in it. So that's just really neat the way that works. Again, circle would do the same thing. Polyline would do the same thing. And again, text would not, obviously would ignore the word gas in the middle of it, but it will take on the cyan color that I've applied to that. Okay, the last layer. The last layer is layer 4. He's going to have a color of blue. So again, draw myself a polyline. And what I've got going on here, again, I'm just drawing these things. They can represent all those features we were looking at before on my map. And this one is a dash line, so you can see that. I mean, that background might be a little hard for you guys to see. Hopefully it's not. Again, colors, or circle rather, arcs, whatever, they all take on these guys. Okay, so that, let's say that represents my map now. So now, what can I do with that? So I can begin to start to look at how visibility comes into play here. And again, if you think about this, by stripping out certain levels of information, I actually have a new picture. So if I go up and freeze, for instance, or turn off, I could either turn off or freeze layer 0. Notice when you hit the freeze, it turns to what I call a snowflake. Come out here, notice the objects that were on that layer are gone. If I freeze layer 1, they're gone, and freeze layer 3, they're gone. So really that subset of objects right there can be a unique picture that you could then take and plot for somebody, and they don't even know those other objects are there. And quite frankly, they may not care, okay? So you can freeze every layer except the current layer, okay? So there's one thing about the current layer that's unique. The current layer can never be frozen, okay? Let me say that again. The current layer can never be frozen. So you're always going to get this message when you try to freeze the current layer. But any other layer out there can be frozen. So if I thaw and thaw, again, look at that picture is different than what I had before, okay? So I'm going to go out and thaw everything. So from a visibility standpoint, what I see on the screen is what my printer will see exactly, okay? And if you have a color printer, you can send these colors out to the printer. So I have a color printer here, and when I go in to do a plot preview, you're going to see the colors as they show up here. All right, so let's take a look at on off, because we saw how freeze thaw, but I'm going to show you a couple of things about this. So notice I can turn off the 0 layer, okay? Turn off layer 1, turn off layer 2, turn off layer 3, and it all looks like we just said before, right? That looks no different. However, here's something I can do that's just unique. Remember we said we cannot turn off the current layer, or freeze the current layer, excuse me, but we can turn off the current layer. So if you turn off the current layer, that layer is no longer visible, but that doesn't mean you can't draw on it. So it's like drawing with blinders. So for instance, if I go out here now and draw a circle, it looks like, whoa, that didn't do anything, right? But it actually did. It actually drew that circle. So that would not be a very smart move, okay? So you would not want to turn your layer off, because then you can't see what you're drafting. All right, so let's take a look at something now. I want to show you how protection works with this. So I'm going to go out and I am going to show you the difference between freezing layers and thawing layers and how that affects selection sets, like we talked about last week. So I'm going to go out here and I'm going to turn off, 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 okay, and leave that on. So I'm going to go to the erase command, and I'm going to tell it to erase all and hit enter. Now, there's a circle here, and I think that's a polyline, so there's really two objects, but if you notice down here it says it found 20 objects, okay? It found 20 objects because it also found the objects that are turned off. So if I hit enter right now, I've deleted my entire drawing. So if I go back and turn on, turn on, turn on, turn on, notice there's nothing there. So that's not a good thing. So I'm going to undo back until I get these guys back. Okay, so we're going to contrast that. Watch what happens when we freeze things. I'm going to freeze, 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 and I can't freeze the current drawing, but I'm going to do this erase again. So I'm going to say erase all, enter, and it found 2 objects, but if I open this up, it'll tell me, I don't know if it'll tell me that. Well, it only found 2 objects, so 2 out of 20. So if I go ahead and execute this erase, when I thaw these objects back, notice they're still there. So the freeze gives it protection, and the on-off does not. So that's a really good reason to want to probably use freeze thaw over on-off. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. So let's talk about another type of protection, and that type of protection is called locking a layer. So you notice when we open this guy up, there's little locks here, okay? So all of those layers can be locked, all of those layers can be unlocked. The current layer can also be locked, so that's not an issue. You can still draw on a locked layer. You just can't select objects that are locked. So if I lock layer 0 and I lock layer 4 and I lock layer 3, you notice that these guys are dimming, hopefully. And when I look at them, they're dimmer than they were. And if I take my cursor up to that, notice that little lock that pops out, okay? Let me turn my, well, actually that's still on. So I'm gonna turn that quick, no, it is on. Okay, so I'm gonna, there's that lock that pops up, okay? That's locked. That one's locked. That one's locked. That one's not. So what does that mean in the grander scheme of things? So if I go out here and I do a selection like this, notice it looks like it's selected everything, but if I hit delete, it only deleted what was unlocked, okay? So it cannot, even though you can physically select those objects or look like you're selecting them, if they are locked, they will not be selectable. Okay, now they are O-snappable. So what that means is you notice that this drawing is locked, or that object is locked, I guess I should say, because it's on that locked layer. If I wanted to draw a line from the center of that circle to the center of that circle, which they're both locked, I could do center snap to center snap and then hit enter, okay? And actually then that's cool because that allows me to use them for O-snaps but protect them totally. So the lock is your ultimate protection, still makes them visible, still allows you to O-snap, and all of these layers could be locked if you wanted to have that, okay? Including the current layer. So that's got no impact on that, okay? So that's a really good property. So I'm going to go ahead and set these back on. And by the way, you can change the amount that these guys are getting using that change in the dimness or not. So there's a way you can set that up. And in fact, I think you can even turn it off so it doesn't even show you dimness if you're locked. But it's nice to have that because it truly does show you what's going on there. All right, so we're going to talk about the property of transparency. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go out and draw myself a polyline that's wide and maybe a donut or two, just so we can see this. So I'm going to put this on a vibrant layer so that I can see this a little bit better. So I got the 0 layer. I'm going to make that current. I'm going to go into a polyline, and I'm going to pick a point. And I want to give this some width. So I'm just gonna, let's say, oh, I don't know, that's 2 units. Let's see how wide. Yeah, that's pretty good. That's a real nice width. So I'm going to run that polyline across that and do that, okay? And I'm going to do me a donut here. And again, I'm going to set my 0 diameter, or my inside diameter, into 0, and I'm going to set my outside diameter to 4. So I'm going to place that also over a couple of objects so that I can see that they're physically sitting on top. All right, so as you notice and you look at this, you can see that, now remember, these guys are all sitting on the same plane, all right? But you'll notice that the polyline seems or appears to be sitting on top of that object and that object and that object, okay? Technically, it's not, because there's no zeniths happening here. But the reality is that there is a time difference between when this guy was created and that guy was created. So this guy was created earlier than this one. So from a time standpoint, this one is on top of it from front of time. It's the most recent. So you notice that that wide polyline is blocking the view of that line behind it. Now, that might be a good thing or it might not be. So you may want to change that. So we can do that by one of 2 ways, and I'm going to show you. One is dependent on the layer settings, and the other one is not. So I'm going to show you the one that is not dependent on layer settings first. And this is what we call draw order. So draw order basically flips the time frame of when this guy was drawn with respect to those guys. So notice I'm going to click on this object. He highlights, right click, and I'm going to go to this guy called draw order, which is not quite in the middle of that. So notice I can select it to bring that object to the front, basically so that it's, it's more recent in time, or I can send it to the back. So I'm going to send it to the back, and when I do that, you'll notice, oh, now I can see those lines. That line's shown up and that line's shown up. And so now this will print just the way we see it. I'll have those lines running through it. So I may want to have it like this, or I may want to have it like this, where this guy's hiding it, okay? So I can swap the draw order of these objects anytime I want. That's not a big deal. I can click on this guy or that guy and swap draw order. So I'm going to bring this back to the state that it was. Draw order, going to bring it to the front. Okay, so let's see what happens when we look at layer transparency. So layer transparency is going to make this thing so you start to see through it. It'll still retain its solid shape, but you begin to see objects behind it. So we're going to go into, we can't do the layer transparency settings in here, unfortunately. So we're going to have to go to the layer properties manager. So the layer that we want to adjust the transparency on is the 0 layer. So what we're going to do is go here to transparency. 0 is the most non-transparent or opaque, so you can't see that. So I'm going to bop this up to like 50. So I'm about halfway between in its transparency. Going to go ahead and okay that. You notice I'm starting to see that. It's not really still a little bit opaque, but you can start to see that behind it, right? You can see like the white one really well, the red starting to show up. And again, if I plotted it this way, I can plot transparency. So that's also kind of nice. So I could make that more transparent. So we're going to go to transparency, and let's make that to the most, well, a little bit more. We'll make it 80, not quite the most transparent. And you'll notice how that affects that. So it's becoming a lot more in the background, and objects are starting to show up through it. Okay. And then if we go to the most transparent state, which it maxes out at 90, we'll see what that looks like. And so that works. So any object that is on that layer, notice takes on that transparency. That's got nothing to do, strictly speaking, with the fact that it's a polyline, because you notice those lines and that circle, they're also taking on transparency. It's all based on what the layer is saying. Okay. Hopefully everybody gets the idea on that. All right. So we pretty much looked at everything in here, right? So we've looked at on-off, freeze-thaw, lock, color, line type. Let's take a look at line weight. Okay, so line weight allows you to change your line weights from a thinner line to a heftier line. Now, if you do this, you have to turn on a line weight variable that allows you to show it up on screen. So when I set this, so let's go, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to go to layer 3, and I'm going to set that to a heavier line weight. And you'll notice that's pretty heavy. Okay, that's the heaviest. And if I come out of here and I even do a regeneration, nothing's going to happen. You notice it's not showing up on the screen. But that object actually does have a line weight. So if we go to the printer, let's go to the printer here real quick. I'm going to go to the printer, and I'm going to grab my printer here at home. Okay, so I'm just grabbing my printer. And I'm going to look at the what's called the extents on this. And notice that plot objects with line weights is turned on. I'm going to also toggle on plot objects with transparency. Okay. I'm going to look at this as a center view, and I'm going to preview it. And you'll notice here, you notice that transparency shows up, and also these objects that didn't look thick on the screen now look thick on the printer, because this is what line weight is doing for me. And in fact, you can notice that was the one that has the gas line in it, and it actually is overwritten basically the word gas. So that one wasn't a really good thing to deal with. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and escape out of here. All right, so I'm going to go back and set my line weights back to default. I very rarely use line weights. Sometimes I do, but if I do, I really want to turn them on so that I can see them. So we're going to see how to do that. Okay, so here's something that somebody may have been thinking about, and it's like, well, what happens if I get an object on the wrong layer? Okay, that happens. You know, you have the 0 layer current, and you drew an object, and it's like, oh, I really didn't want it on that layer. Okay, so what I can do is change the property of the layer itself, and it's or of the object's layer property. So what I can do is just very easily click on the layer, or the object, excuse me. And when I do that, this dialog box up here, the control dialog box, will show me what the layer is. So notice I clicked on that object. He shows me that that's on the 0 layer. If I open this up, I can say, well, I really want to move that to layer 2. Okay. So once I do that, it's moved. And then after you do that, you want to hit the escape key to deselect it. Because if that guy's still active, you can do other things with it. So again, I'm going to do that one more time. I'm going to click on the object I want to change, and I'm going to come up here and click on the layer name that I want to change it to, and then I'm going to hit the escape key. So I can move any layer, any object from one layer to another, unless the layer would happen to be locked and I wouldn't be able to select it. So that might be the thing that would preclude you from doing that. So that's a really nice way of changing things up. So the other thing we can deal with is what are called properties, all right? And properties exist for each object independent of the properties of the layer. So what we're looking at in that layer properties manager, these are called layer properties: on, off, freeze thaw, lock, unlock, plot, no plot, color, line type, line weight, and transparency. So objects also have properties. So we're going to click on an object, doesn't matter which one, right click, and we're going to go to the properties dialog box. And notice this guy pops up, and you'll see these are the general properties of an object. Each object has a color, a layer, a line type scale, a plot style, a line weight, transparency, hyperlink, and thickness. So the ones that are important to understand is that color, line type, line weight, and transparency also exist under layers. So if you set a color up here for an object that is different than the layer, it will override what the layer is saying. Same thing with the line type, same thing with the line weight, and same thing with the transparency. So the way most CAD people do it, okay, the way that 90% of the CAD people do it in the world is they use layers to make their objects look the way they want them to. You have more control. If you go in and start messing around with this stuff in here, you can have a lot of problems, okay? But you can fix things in this dialog box also, which is kind of neat. Some other things that are pretty cool while we're looking at properties, notice there's geometric properties. So you notice this says that radius of that circle that is highlighted is 4.0627 whatever. Well, I can say, well, I want that radius to be 5. And I just type that in and it automatically changed it. Or you can say, I want that area to be 75 square units. And it calculated what radius it needed to make that happen. So that's a really, really cool thing. Okay, so let me show you what happens. Go ahead and if you get out of there, hit the escape key, because once you de-highlight that, then it's no longer active. So let's see what happens. I'm going to go ahead, by the way, let's go up to this. I'm going to go to this transparency and set it back to 0 so that we can see that white up a little bit better, because that's really getting kind of, yeah, that's better. All right, so what happens if you start playing around with these guys? Okay, so if you go in here and let's say you set the current color to magenta, okay? What I have done is I have set what's called a color override. So here's what this means. No matter what the layer color says, it's always going to be superseded by what this says, okay? Now the downside to that is when I look at my colors, I will not know what layer I'm on, okay? When I look at these colors here, I know what layer I'm on because I basically set it up, unless I have like five layers that have green, okay? And I'm going to do something else with the line type here. So I'm going to set my line type to, let's find a good one here. I'm going to set my line type to tracks, okay? So I have two overrides going on here. I got a magenta color and I got a tracks layer, okay, color or line type. All right, so what happens now? If I go out, notice I have the 0 layer current, okay? So it should be white and it should be continuous. So I'm gonna go out here and I'm gonna draw a circle and bang, lo and behold, that circle is not white, nor is it continuous. It's now magenta and it's tracks. The problem is, as I look at this, I'm not sure what layer it's on. I know it's on the 0 layer because we just created it, but I want to show you something. I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to move him to layer 2, which should be green and zigzag. And notice it doesn't change color, nor does it change line type. And to prove that it's on the green layer, watch. If we open this guy up and we freeze him, you can notice he disappears because it was on that layer. Okay, so this becomes a problem. And again, the problem is that I don't know what layer that's on, and this is overriding all the other colors and other principles. So you can do that with color, you can do that with line weights, and you can do that with line types, and you can also do it with transparency. So those are things that, again, adopt it one way or the other, but my suggestion in the way that I know most people do it is by layer, by layer, by layer. So to fix this, and I'm going to draw a couple other objects out here. I'm just going to go back out here and, I'm saying that's actually, these guys are actually on 2 different layers, okay? So for instance, if I, again, freeze that guy, notice they're on 2 different layers, even though they look identical because they have the same principle in terms of color and line type. So to fix this, the first thing you want to do is you want to select this back to say by layer, and you want to select that back to say by layer. That's probably one of your overriding principles, okay? Then to fix these, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these guys. Actually, I need to grab them all. right click and go to properties. I could equally set, there's a properties like if you go that way, but if I go to properties here, notice for those objects, it says that the layer varies because it doesn't know which layer I'm talking about. The color is magenta and the tracks are the line type. So I'm going to open up this guy. I'm going to set it to by layer. And I'm going to open up this guy and I'm going to set it to by layer. And it's going to fix those objects. And notice, as a matter of fact, it took them back to the color scheme for the white layer, for the layer 0, and this is the color scheme and the line type scheme for layer 3. Okay, so that's a great thing of know how to do it. So here's another cool thing. If you want to change the entire layer up, you just change the properties on it. Okay, so if I want to make layer 2 now, instead of green, I want to make it magenta, I just go in and grab that and click out, and notice that made a mass change on all of your objects. Okay, so layers are going to be the name of the game. Everything that you get into and AutoCAD, or particularly on your higher level stuff, it's all based on layers. Let's take a look at the line types. Okay, so you may have noticed, depending on how you were drawing, that yours might not show up kind of like mine, and it also depends on how big your objects are and that kind of stuff. When you create line types, they are created so that they are a scale factor. So, you know, this might be, that space might be a 1/2 inch, that might be a 1/2 inch, that might be a 1/2 inch, and that might be 2 inches. So that's going to change based on how long or short that line is. So there's a multiplier out there that you can multiply all your line types by, and it's called the line type scale factor. And so if I just type in LTS and hit enter, notice that my line type scale factor is set to 1. So this is a multiplier on these spacings, okay? So if I want to make those spacings twice as big as they are, I would type in 2, and notice what it did. If I want to make them half as big, that would be 0.5 or 0.1, okay? So notice if I go one way, they get small. If I go the other way, they get big. And if they're too big, if they can't fit on the object, then you just don't have it. It looks like it's continuous. It's really not continuous, but it does look at that. Now notice that it affected every one of these line types equally. So look at my zigzag. I really almost lost the look of zigzag. Center line's still showing up on that one, but it's not showing up on that one. Gas line's affected. So this scale factor down here, LTS, this is called a global scale factor. Global means it multiplies everything equally. The only line type that it doesn't affect is continuous, because continuous is continuous. It doesn't matter. So normally you might start out with 1 and then adjust it up or down from there. Now there's another line type value out there. This is a little confusing. But if you look at this object, if I click on that object, each object also has a line type scale factor on it. So when I go to right click properties, notice this object, this circle has a LT scale factor of 1. So that number gets multiplied by the global scale factor. So in this case, 1 times 1 is 1. If I go in here and set this to 1/2, the scale factor on this is now 1/2, because 1/2 times 1 is 1/2, but this is still set to 1 because 1 times 1 is 1. So again, you've got 2 ways of setting line type scales, and it's really suggested that you leave all of the objects set to 1, and then you just adjust it globally because it's just usually one setting. So I normally leave that to 1, and then I just do it via the LT scale, which is the global scale factor, and I set that to 1. Okay, so we're going to look at the command called line type. So I'm going to type in line type, and this brings up this dialog box. So basically you have the manager. This is where I can load, unload, delete line types. By the way, if you're not using a line, for instance, I can click on these guys. If I'm not using these, I can just delete them, and that just gets them out of the database. Any object that's being used, though, or any line type that's being used cannot be deleted. So we're going to go here to this thing called show details. And what this does is shows me the global setting for my line types and the current line type scale. So this guy's the important one. So you usually want that set to 1 because what that says is when you create a line type, that line type or I'm sorry, when you create an object, that object is going to be at a factor of 1. This guy is the one I'm setting through the LT scale factor down here at the command line, okay? So leave this to 1 always, okay? And then just adjust this up or down. That's the easiest way to do line types. Otherwise, it gets to be a real mess, okay? And we'll be dealing with that because we're going to start to have lines and line types and all that kind of stuff. So you're going to kind of start to see how this works, okay? So that's the line type command. Okay, I think you can also get to that by clicking on that. It didn't take it, so some of these are a little bit easier to find than the others. So if I go into the line weights, let's go into the line weights. So if I type in line weight, right, pull up the line weight settings box. So notice right now, you can either have them set to millimeters or inches. So it's default for millimeters, but if I click it on inches, notice it'll show me what my inch settings are. You can also notice that the default line type is not 0. It's actually 0.01. If you don't use anything, if you don't use that number, your printer will not see those lines, okay? So again, I usually don't set that to something smaller than that. I always use the default. Now, if you want to display the line weights on the screen, you toggle this guy on right here, and then we can like drag this up to show you what they look like, okay? So remember, notice that it's showing me that I have got line weight on there. Okay, so that's an exaggerated line weight. But if I had some objects that had more line weight, they would show up thicker or really with more weight. So remember I showed you before is that when I print is when line weights really show up. This is allowing me to see them on the screen, but I personally do not like to draft with line weights on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that toggle off. I'm going to toggle that off. And I could, if I did even, I might not set that so high. I just wanted to show you what's going on. So I never mess with this too much. I pretty much leave it alone. Okay. All right. So I think we've covered layer, color, line weight, LT scale. LT scale is probably one of the harder ones to think about. So once you get into it. So we're going to look at match props, and then I want to show you a little bit about plotting. Now the last thing we're going to cover here is the UCS a little bit. So match props, this is a great little tool. So if I have, let's say, this object out there and I want this to be on the same layer with the same color and all of that, I can use this property or this command called match props. You select what's called the source object first, and then you just come down here and you just select what you want to change. Notice how nice that is. That just, you know, I can get that line, that circle, whatever, and when you're done, you just hit enter. So I love that little tool. It's quick, it's easy, it just makes its changes. Now you can do this with the match props, which is kind of neat. If you go to settings here, you can tell it what to match and what not to match. So you could say, well, I want to match the layer, but I don't want to match the color, and I don't want to match the line type. So I can create overrides, in other words. So for instance, if I go to this guy here, it didn't override it, but sometimes it'll override your color and so you can have different settings based on what you got going on. But match props is a really, really cool tool for a lot of things, for text, for dimensions, for some of the other higher level objects that you get into. It's a great little tool. Let me undo a couple things back. Give me a little bit more. I'm going to take that out a little bit. Okay, that looks pretty good. All right, so let's say we want to now plot this picture, but this is my picture, but I don't want to plot all of it because let's say I've got some things in here that I don't really want anybody else to see. They might be just stuff that I'm using for control purposes, or they might be some other thing that I'm dealing with. So in my layers, I can say, well, I don't want to plot the 0 layer. And maybe I don't want to plot the blue layer. So I don't want to plot 0 layer, and I don't want to plot layer 4. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to no plot. Notice everything still looks good on the screen, but I'm going to go into the plot command now, and I'm going to set that to my printer. I'm going to do a display or an extents. I'm going to fit it, center it, and I'm going to preview it. And you notice what's missing. What's missing is the white objects, and then there was a blue object showing up around here. So that's a way of getting rid of all of that. Okay. Of course, we could also do that by freezing and thawing layers, but the downside to freezes and thaws, or freezes and offs, is that they don't. Whoops. They don't. They do not. I printed my picture. They didn't mean to. The downside to that is that they won't show up on the screen. So I might want to have those on the screen while I'm working. I just don't want to show those to somebody. It's kind of like my dirty laundry. So I don't want anybody to see that except for me here. Okay. So that's layers. We talked about creating layers. We talked about setting up properties on layers. We talked about being able to move objects from one layer to another. We talked about object properties, and remember, this is probably the one be careful with. Just make those always say by layer, by layer, by layer. People, when they first start out, they discover color right away, and so they start setting colors up, but then you could draw, this picture could all be on the 0 layer and still be all these colors, okay? And that's again, that's not a good thing because you have no layer flexibility. There's some other tools up here that are pretty cool. Like for instance, if you want to make this object or that layer current, you just come up here and you say make current. Notice it made that layer current for me, so I don't have to go through those dialog boxes. Or if I want to freeze a layer, just say I want to freeze that layer. I can't freeze it because it's current, but I can freeze that layer. This is a really neat tool right here. This is called isolate. So isolate means that it's going to go in and turn every other object off except the one you isolate. So if I go here and I say isolate that and hit enter, notice it isolated everything except that. So that's a quick tool. Like for instance, if I come over here, this guy's a very complex thing. So I could isolate just the trees and quickly it got rid of everything that I didn't want to see. And then they have this unisolate tool, so it turns everything back on. So what it really does, when you isolate, it goes in and it turns every layer in your drawing. Come on. There you go. It turns every layer off except the one that you've isolated. And then when you unisolate, what it'll do is it just turns them all back on. That's a pretty cool little tool. So there's some other ones. You can lock layers very effectively. You can read these when you get into these. These are nice. These are real nice. Match props is pretty cool. Let me show you that one. I'm going to unisolate in here. Match layer is nice. So if I want to match, it's kind of a match props, but it's just doing it with layers. So I want to make that layer and that one, those objects coincident. Oops, I did it wrong. I got to select the one I want to match. I always do it wrong. I had to match that, enter, and then you have to select that. Okay, so it's kind of reversed to the way this one works, though. All right, so there's your layering commands. Okay. All right, so we are going to talk about the UCS, and let's see. I'm going to get out of here. I don't see my UCS, interestingly enough. Let me see if I can grab that. I must have turned my UCS off. So let me see something here. There it is. Yeah, my UCS. Oh, there it is. There's my UCS. Okay, so let's talk about the UCS. So the UCS, this is called your UCS icon. Okay, and we did talk about that the very first lecture. That's going to indicate, that's an indicator that shows me the direction of positive X space, positive Y space, and positive Z space, because that little box is there. And this guy is what we call a virtual object, so he never prints. And so does the grid. The grid never prints. That's also a virtual object. So this is kind of cool because you can manipulate this guy. And I'm going to draw a line up here like this. So I can manipulate that so that I basically can paste the grid on this line. So you notice that this grid right now is not coincident with this line at all. But the UCS allows me to do this. Now this UCS, some of you may have discovered it, it's, first of all, this icon, let's take a look at that first. The command that allows us to manipulate this guy is called the UCS icon command. Or actually, I should say, take that back. You can manipulate it with the UCS command you can change the settings of how it looks on the UCS icon command. So I'm going to type in UCS, which stands for User Coordinate System, UCS icon, hit enter, and it pops up this right here. So I can turn this guy on, this is currently on. If I turn him off, notice he disappears. So if you don't like seeing that, that's sometimes people don't like it. You're not using it, turn it off, turn it on. I can set it to what's called an origin state or no origin. So what origin means is that it's going to always go to where the origin is. If I zoom out of this, notice it stays right on the origin. If I go to no origin, it's always going to stay in that corner regardless of where the origin is. So the origin right here, that's the actual 0, 0, 0 of the origin, but it's showing up down here. And that's because of the way that's set. You can also make this guy what we call selectable. I'll show you what I mean by that. And then we have properties. So properties allow me to make a different look to the UCS. So you can change it to what's called a 2D UCS or the more common 3D UCS. You can change the size of this, and this is based on pixels. So there's right now 50 pixels. I can make it bigger by dragging that, or I can make it smaller. You can change the color. Color is currently white. You can make it whatever color you want. And there's also actually two types of UCSs. I'm going to show you. I'm not going to make any changes, but this is called the model space UCS. If I get into paper space, this is your paper space UCS. So there is a difference. And notice this one's blue because that dialog box said it was blue. So I'm going to go back to the model. So let's talk about selectable UCSs. I want to set one more thing back. I like my UCS to be set to origin typically, so that it kind of moves with the origin. But if the origin is not on the screen, it always will hug the corner like that. So once the origin is available, notice it picks up, but if it can't see the origin, it'll go back in the lower corner. So what does selectable mean? Well, selectable means is if you click on the UCS, you get these guys called grips. And this grip right here allows you to move the UCS, and this grip allows you to rotate it. So if I want to make this object or this UCS coincident with this object, I can click on the move grip, move him to the endpoint, and then I can rotate him to that object's endpoint. So now when I was talking before, that grid is now perfectly aligned with that object. This is a particularly important thing when you're dealing with three-dimensional stuff. It has some really good relevance when we get into 2D stuff, and we're going to see how this works because I'm going to have you guys use this in some 2D applications. In fact, assignment 4 is going to use this very thing. So what we have done is we have created now what's called a user UCS as opposed to the original UCS. And you'll notice if you hit the escape key, this thing looks different than the other UCS because it doesn't have that box down there any longer. Okay, so that tells me I'm in what's called a user mode. So there's really a UCS, a user coordinate system, that is always in effect in AutoCAD, and then I can have multiple user UCSs. So the one that's always in effect is called the world UCS. Okay, so right now to get this back to the world, you can't just drag it. That's not going to work. Okay, so to do that, we're going to have to go into a command called UCS. UCS, not the UCS icon, UCS. So notice this guy has a bunch of different sub options, but one of the sub options here is world. And in fact, that's the default. So if you want to just type in UCS and you hit enter again, it'll drop me back to the world. And notice my grid rotated back where it was. I'm back on the original world UCS, and that box is showing up. That tells me I'm in the world setup. Okay. So if you ever get this out of whack, it's real easy to do that. If I have to whack that out like that, that's going to screw me up because all the coordinates now are going to be based on this, not the original. So if you had started out your project in the world system and you did this, all your new coordinates are not going to line up with your other ones. So again, to get that back, to fix that, all you got to do, UCS, enter, and that'll fix it. So there's one sub option in there that's pretty cool, and that's called a sub option of object. So this allows me to line the UCS up on any object that I want just by touching the object. So I'm going to do a couple things here. I'm going to put some objects down here like this. So if I want to line this up and work on each successive line, I just would go into UCS, select OB for object, select the object, bang, there's my new UCS. Do it again, use the sub option object, take him to that line. And it's a real quick, easy selection to make this happen, okay? And the advantage, and you're not going to see this, probably some of you are thinking, well, what is that really doing for me? This is allowing me to work on a grid that's related to this line, and the other one was the grid that was related to that line. Now, if you have 3D objects, and you're working, let's say, on your roof, okay, and your roof is angled with respect to your horizontal plane, if you establish a UCS up on that roof, like you're shingling it, it's going to be a lot easier to work on that roof than it is going to be to try to establish something on the roof from the floor. So that's why UCSs for three-dimensional applications are extremely important. But for what we're doing, UCS object is going to be really nice, going to line stuff up, and then ultimately when we get done, we'll set everything back to the world. Okay? And one mention about the world is a constant in use in AutoCAD. You can never destroy the world in AutoCAD. So even when you're working in a user system, all of your coordinates are being calculated in the user system, but they're also being calculated in the world system. So you really can't destroy things, and you can always get back to the world if you move it. But be really careful, because it's real easy to not recognize that this thing is grippable, and you don't even really know it sometimes. You just hit it a little bit, and it just changed things. But if you look at this, you notice again, it doesn't have that box there, so that should be the key indicator for me that I'm not in the world. But if as a new user, you don't always see that that's the issue, okay? So again, back to UCS, world, and we're good to go. Whoops. Whoops. There we go. All right, now I'm back in business. All right, so we covered a lot of ground. We're going to be dealing with layers, and we're going to be dealing with the UCS on the next project. So I think you'll like this next project we're going to get into. So I will be back Monday. This will be available for you Monday, and I will be there on Wednesday for sure, and we will be working on our next assignment, and we'll proceed from that point. So I will see everybody in a couple days.